The Cor Anglais, corno inglese, English horn, or English horn. These are all modern names for the tenor member of the oboe family, whose most famous solo is probably the Largo from Dvorak's New World Symphony, or, for those of a certain age, the Hovis advert. The origins of this beautiful and melancholy instrument are shrouded in mystery, but one thing is certain: it is not English. Old legends tell that in 1760 the virtuoso oboist Giuseppe Ferlendis, or possibly his brother Pietro, invented the corno inglese. Unfortunately, this cannot be true because we have music written for the corno inglese before 760. Whoops! The earliest true tenor oboes were probably invented in France in the 1670s and 1680s, a decade or so after the ordinary oboe had been invented there. This tenor oboe was usually called the taille de hautbois and fulfilled the role of the middle voice in oboe bands and military music. This instrument quickly spread throughout Europe, and when it arrived in England, it was known as the tenor hautboy. Still no mention of it being English, though. It was also popular in Germany, where Johann Sebastian Bach wrote for the instrument as the taille de hautbois. But in Germany, around this time, we also find another interesting evolutionary development, the oboe da caccia. In Saxony and Silesia in the 1720s, instrument makers began to experiment with the body of the tenor oboe, curving it in shape, wrapping it in leather, and on two stunning examples from Leipzig, adding a flared brass bell instead of the more common wooden bell. The curvature of the instrument has nothing to do with it being easier to hold, and has been described as a poetic conceit, an unnatural adaptation of the attributes of a brass instrument into one made of wood. The curved conceit was probably responsible for its being named oboe da caccia, in imitation of the corno da caccia, or hunting horn. That became the orchestral French horn, which, incidentally, is about as French as the English horn is English. But wait, I called it an oboe da caccia, so where does the cor come from? Didn't I say it was like a corno da caccia? It's all very confusing, isn't it? And it's about to get a little bit more confusing. But recent research by Katarzyna Pilipiuk, an oboist from Poland, looks like it's cleared up the situation nicely. In 1723, one of the earliest references to this instrument in a musical score calls the instrument corne d'anglois, or corno angelico, the angelic horn. This is probably because the sound is soft, sweet, and has a heavenly quality to it, at least if you ask me. So it looks like we found where the cor, or horn, part of the name comes from. But to uncover the next part of the mystery of the Englishness, we have to look to the German language. Now, the High German word for angelic is Engelisch. So the instrument could have been translated as Engelisch horn, angelic horn. The trouble is that the German word for English is also Engelisch. So it looks like we have an instrument name that might have lost or gained rather a lot in translation, since from this German English horn we also get corno inglese, cor anglais and English horn. We've seen how makers started curving the tenor oboe and adding a flared wooden or brass bell on the end. But in 1732, a Polish instrument maker named Weigl decided to add a round bulbous bell to the end of the oboe da caccia. This had the effect of veiling the sound even more. Bulbous bells, also known as Liebesfoot or love feet in German, had existed on tenor oboes before this time, and also on oboes d'amore. But Weigl's were probably the first to introduce the bulbous bell to the curved tenor oboe. As the 18th century drew on, instrument makers began to make the angle sharper, so pronounced in fact that it eventually became a kink. Now it's held together by this little knee joint. This has given rise to the suggestion that perhaps Cor Anglais or angled horn was the origin of the name, but it seems that the angelic horn is more likely. All the other adaptations which became applied to the oboe were also applied to the Cor Anglais in the intervening years, so that eventually it gained as much keywork as the modern oboe. Both curved and angled forms of the Cor Anglais continued to be made well into the 19th century, though by the end of the century, mostly straight instruments were being made, bringing us back full circle to the straight tenor oboes of the 18th century. But it's the sound of the instrument which makes it so special. Composers usually exploit its softer side, but certain composers also exploit its more extrovert side. Haydn was an early adopter of the Cor Anglais, which he wrote for famously in the Philosopher Symphony. The first movement has a slow, plaintive melody, but by the last movement, the Cor Anglais are allowed to rollick along with the rest of the orchestra. There is also a scrap of manuscript music by Mozart, which looks like it could have been written for Cor Anglais and string trio, though no instrument names are included on the scrap. He left the music unfinished, and some scholars suggest that it might actually be written for the Cor Anglais' kinky clarinet cousin, the basset horn. We may never know for certain, but the theme which he used begins very similarly to Mozart's famous Ave Verum Corpus and does sound beautiful on the classical Cor Anglais.